This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
We are looking into Bill C353, the Foreign Hostage Takers Accountability Act. Pursuant to order of reference of Wednesday, June 5th, 2024, the committee is commencing consideration of Bill C353, again, which relates to Foreign Hostage Takers Accountability Act. I'd now like to welcome Ms. Lantsman to the committee. Very grateful that you made the time to be with us today. For your opening remarks, you have 5 minutes, after which we will go to the members for follow-up questions. Ms. Lantsman, the floor is yours.
Sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've seen this movie before, so it's nice to be here. Thanks for my colleagues for welcoming here, and it's certainly an interesting experience sitting on this side of the table and not being able to use my own microphone. I'm here today to tell you about my legislation, C353, or the Foreign Hostage Takers Accountability Act. And how I think it'll be an important asset for Canada in an uncertain world. And since this bill was introduced, I can confidently say that the world's become a much more dangerous and unstable place. Nations like China, Iran, Russia are more than ever intent on disrupting the global world order and the established balance of powers. And we've seen that in the aggressive invasions like the one in Ukraine or the one perpetrated by Hamas in Israel are on the verge of exploding into regional and global wars. And it's our nation's values of peace and freedom and democracy that are increasingly under siege. And throughout the history of global conflict, hostage-taking has been employed as a tactic that's use is only growing, and I mentioned that in the deliberations in the House on this bill. And we've seen it used predominantly in the Hamas attacks against Israel, even impacting Canadian citizens. And that, of course, came after this bill was introduced, which proves again why its adoption, frankly, I think probably is overdue in this country. And in a time of turmoil, we should do everything possible for Canadians traveling abroad and protect them from hostile states, groups, individuals. And looking at our current law, it's clear that there is a deficiency, and I think more can be done. And that's why I'm here today. So when lives and livelihoods are at stake, the value of comprehensive, up-to-date, modern legislation to prevent and mitigate hostage-taking situations cannot be understated, and this bill provides the much-needed update to fix the existing laws, or at least add to them. It would strengthen our ability to deter, to minimize, and resolve instances of hostage-taking and arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations. And it would increase our power to levy sanctions, support families, and encourage global cooperation. And it would also provide the much-needed assistance to those families of hostages who endure extreme stress while their loved ones remain in captivity abroad. And simply put, it would be a vital tool in the arsenal, helping us to continue to protect the rights of Canadians abroad and support those affected by hostage-taking. So here's what it will not do. Just to make clear, it will not incentivize kidnapping or effective ransom payments to hostile entities. I know that that's been suggested. It will not place too much power in the hands of individual federal ministers, and it will not be rendered redundant by existing legislation. In short, there is a gap between what Canada could say and what Canada could do. And this bill is brought forth with a desire to address the gap and help protect the rights and inherent dignity of Canadians wherever and whenever they might be in danger. Since introducing the bill, I've received questions from colleagues on all sides of the House, and I'll take that for what it's worth, maybe a positive showing the proactive interest in this piece of legislation. And I'm looking forward to addressing some of those questions here and any additional questions that may arise from the testimony today and of my group and the Uyghur.
We now go to questions, and I understand MP Epp, you're first up, and you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague, both for being here and for introducing this legislation. 3 main pillars that you're looking to address, and so let's start with the first one. In your opening comments, you talked about a gap. This committee has undertaken a study. We review and we get constant notices about the sanctions that this government is applying. Where can you identify a little bit more the gap between our present sanctions legislation and what your bill will do to enhance that, specifically with respect to hostage taking?
Okay, so I know that there are members and others who have raised questions about whether our existing sanctions regimes would be enough, and particularly around both SEMA, the Special Economic Measures Act, and the Magnitsky laws, and they don't specifically address hostage taking, and I think that a dedicated sanctions regime for this particular issue is probably something worth exploring in this country as a deterrent, and to give us even more tools in the arsenal to be able to impose sanctions. It would be dedicated for this particular for this particularly, and I think it meets. I think it does something further, and there are lots of obligations that Canada has under international law, and there are further things that are probably mandated and required from us domestically to address this. And there's a number of articles within the UN Hostage Convention, the International Convention of Suppression of Financing and Terrorism, the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 68276, and the Security Council Resolution 2133. So I think not only does it do something that our sanctions currently doesn't do, it helps us adhere to some of the things that I think we're lackluster on.
Thank you. With respect to the families, obviously it's not just the hostage that's so severely affected, but their families are as well. What is presently not covered for support, and how does your bill enhance the support for families?
Here's the thing. This would legislate a requirement, and I think you have to give kudos to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that I know that in all consular cases, and particularly in hostage taking, do everything possible to work with the families. But I think there's an additional step, and I think there is probably a legislated solution that would ensure that the minister has an obligation, a legislative requirement, and we can build out better supports for families. Families are often the ones that are kind of held in the balance. The insane media scrutiny that happens around families that end up in the story of all of this. Like, no family is, no regular family. I don't even think an irregular family is built to deal with, first of all, the very fact that their loved one, that somebody in their family has been either detained or taken hostage, but the fact that the hostages may use that family as a way to influence the media cycle, to turn potentially against the government. I think wrapping your hands around this family and providing support for that family is I don't think it can be understated. I think how important it is. And then understanding that family knows the person that has been taken hostage the best, and potentially could be useful in solving the crisis.
Your comments actually lead right into my next question, and you touched on your opening comments. Hostage-taking diplomacy has become the new global currency for terrorists, and it does seem that we are somewhat, or maybe considerably, ill-prepared for it. Can you even expand a bit more? What will this legislation do that actually help us prepare more for the potential unfortunate reality that we might even see more of this?
So there's an argument that legislation is not necessarily needed around this, and there was probably that argument in 2001 before some of the anti-terror laws. This is different than terrorism, right? It could be one event. It could be a single moment in time. You saw that with some of the most famous acts of terror in the world, a mass casualty event of some kind. This is like a prolonged way to hold an entire government and an entire country almost hostage on the basis of policy, on the basis of what they say, on the basis of its own citizenship that may turn against a country. I think that this is one of the. This is one of the currencies that is going to be used more and more. In fact, we've seen that it's been used more and more by really, really bad actors in the world to hold countries like this one hostage on the basis of all kinds of things like policy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So we now go to MP Alghabra. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Ms. Lantsman. Let me start off by saying that I want to give a shout out to our consular team here in Canada and around the world for the work that they do every day. Hundreds of Canadians are being assisted on a daily basis when they find themselves in a difficult situation. And I'll also start out by saying that I do believe there's room to further strengthen and enhance our consular policies, consular services policies. And I take this attempt in good faith at trying to certainly improve our consular services policies. You know, there's always a tension between how much you prescribe policies and how much flexibility you leave for the officials to respond to the unique situation that they're having to deal with. And the questions that I have about this bill is, does it really find that right balance? So I want to start off by asking you that you've included eligible protected persons in here, non-Canadian citizens. You didn't talk about permanent residents, but eligible protected persons. Can you help me understand how would Canada choose which eligible protected persons that this law would apply to?
So it's actually in the section of the Immigration Act, and I think it's 96 subsection 2. 95 subsection 2, and it's eligible protected persons would be individuals within the meaning of that of IRPA, and it specifically refers to people whom refugee protection is conferred upon.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I understand what the definition of the word means. I'm asking how would Canada choose which of those, because there are thousands on a daily basis of eligible protected persons around the world that find themselves in a difficult position. Which ones would the Canadian government choose to be
So those ones who wouldn't be found to be inadmissible.
So everyone who is found not to be inadmissible.
Correct. And
Okay.
all of this legislation by the colleague.
We're used to
using first names. So, MP Alghabra. I should say that you raised a point in your question that about finding the balance, and in this entire piece of legislation, there is nothing prescriptive. It is all up to the minister's discretion. Everywhere where you think it should be a shall, it's actually a may in the legislation. So that entirely falls on the minister and their prerogative to make those decisions.
It's just, as you can imagine, if this law passes, there will be, again, thousands of families around the world who would expect
And it would
Canada,
be the minister's prerogative.
and then, so the second question I have for you is on arbitrary detention and unfair detention. There are also a lot of Canadians that find themselves in detention in countries where there is no due process. There might be some other motives for their detentions, but they may not fully be under the definition of arbitrary detention. Could be unfair detention. Would this new act apply to them?
Well, the definition under this act is pretty clear on arbitrary detention, and the definitions around arbitrary detention are pretty clear in international law. And again, that discretion is to the minister on whether they would want to confer any of these, any of the pieces of legislation, whether it's take care of their families. They would automatically, in terms of, they would have consular services services already. And so these pieces of legislation, I think, in the case of arbitrary detention, which is delineated in international law, I think it would give the minister additional capacity to act. It's not a have to. It's not a must. It is additional tools in the toolbox.
Sure. And as you can imagine, a lot of these arbitrary detentions are also hard to really figure out because the country that detains an individual doesn't come out and say, this is what we want you to do in return for releasing this individual. So there are a lot of factors that...
Some of them are not very hard to figure out, and that's where I think the discretion of the minister plays a role.
So how would you respond to a family who has a loved one, a Canadian family who has a loved one who is unfairly detained in another country? They're asking the minister at the time, after this law passes, to apply this law, and then the minister says, sorry, the law doesn't apply to your loved one who's unfairly detained.
Without giving me additional information about the intelligence that you would have about the arrest and the and what is around the arrest, there is clear. There is a clear definition to arbitrary detention, which is different than getting arrested, let's say, in Mexico because you were at the wrong place in the wrong time, doing the wrong thing with the wrong suitcase in your hand with the wrong people around you. That could be seen as an...
I'm not talking about those cases. I'm talking about people who are unfairly detained.
I think you have to be more specific about the cases, Minister, to see if this would apply. And again, it's the discretion of the minister to say yes or no whether any of these tools would apply to that. So it's not a requirement. It is an additional set of tools. And I think you could see the examples from the U.S. and what they're studying in Australia to eventually potentially adopt this law would suggest that our allies are on board too.
You know, one area that the NDP have asked Canada to do better on for many years is arbitrary detention. And while arbitrary detention is included in this bill, it's not clear to me whether this would apply to particularly egregious cases, including rendition of Canadians, such as the case of Maharar or Hussein Chalil, who is still held in China after many years, or the Canadians held in northeastern Syria, who this government has refused to bring home to face our justice system here. In your view, does this bill apply to those cases? Could you articulate that? Yeah.
And I think, again, with respect to the minister and the government of the day, I think it's the discretion of the minister, but it's certainly something that we can ask of the minister.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. You know, we are also concerned about the limited resources for criminal investigations in these situations. We've seen this also with enforcement of Canada's sanction regime, that the lack of resources at CBSA, RCMP, and Global Affairs Canada has impacted the effectiveness of our sanction regime. The bill doesn't address the issue of resources to CBSA or the RCMP. Obviously, no bill can address everything, but I'd like to ask you to address that concern and what you believe the government would need to do in order to meet the new standards established in this bill.
Yeah, so I think to your point, given that it's a private member's bill and it already probably requires a royal recommendation, as we heard from the speaker, there's probably a limit to that. But the rewards for justice legislation in the U.S. First of all, it's much bigger. It looks at organized crime, and it's got a ton of administration around it and monetary sort of budgeting within their version of their estimates. But this attempts to work on a small piece of that, and it is going to require some reorganization of resources. But I don't think that it requires anything that Canada doesn't already have in place. I think you can use existing resources within our talented public service, particularly within CBSA, within law enforcement, to reorganize around taking this seriously. And I think it would send a signal around the world that we're serious about this. Given there's a high price tag on a Canadian.
Thank you. The bill does establish the ability to seize any property situated in Canada that is owned or controlled by the foreign entity, state, or national that engaged in hostage-taking or arbitrary detention. So obviously for us, this is a welcome proposal, but we know from experience with Canada's sanction enforcement that the government has very little success in seizing assets of Russian oligarchs and that we have too few resources allocated in this regard. Can you comment again on the lack of resources and what would be required to actually enforce this part of the bill?
Yeah, look, it doesn't necessarily mandate non-state assets, but we've got the JVTA legislation here, which has resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars of seizure of assets. I think that's a much bigger issue that doesn't only speak to, I think, the inadequacies in this country on this specific measures, but frankly of all. Like the justice of the Victims of Terror Act is probably underutilized, and because we're under-resourced in the system I think the rewards have been around $700 million in this country, and I can only imagine of all of the cases that didn't see the light of day because of the lack of resources. So that's a much bigger problem that this piece of legislation isn't going to cover, but I agree with you.
Well, and I would just point out, too, that, you compare it to legislation that's been done in the States, and the States has a significantly larger amount of people that are even proportionality-wise that are being used to enforce the sanction regime and other aspects of this legislation. My last question for you: are you open to amendments to your legislation going forward?
Yeah, look, I'd like to see something passed in this Parliament, despite my actual thought of it being unlikely, that's going to send a signal to the outside world saying that we're taking this seriously, and that if you're going to come after a Canadian, that you better think twice.
It is certainly difficult to get PMBs in the House at the moment, but thank you, Mr. Chair. That's my time.
Thank you. We next go to Mr. Abel-Taif. You have 4 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thanks to MP Lantsman for putting forward this bill in front of the committee and the House at some point. The first job and responsibility of every Canadian government is to protect Canadians everywhere they exist, whether inside or outside Canada. And we have many examples where Canadian governments have stepped up to protect Canadians abroad. And thanks in that case to all the people on the ground that do this tough negotiation and tough work to make sure we get a positive result. The question is, from the past, there was examples of cases that we've experienced. How do you see C353, if was there at that time, how much different that would have made on the negotiation or on the end result for when hostage has been taken or when Canadian being detained deliberately by any foreign group or foreign player?
I think on the specifics, I'm not necessarily, I can't necessarily speak to it, given that we don't have the intelligence around the cases. Let's say I've been asked a number of times, would this have sped up the case of the two Michaels or any such cases? And I think the answer is, if I was to tell you that yes, I think I would, that would be untruthful. But I do think that it adds again tools in the arsenal to be able to potentially do it faster. I think that we do have many examples from the U.S. and obviously some interest from Australia. The Senate is studying a version of this based on this bill to eventually take it to Australian Parliament. So we do know that there are our allies are interested, and we do know that there's been success from the U.S. particularly on their justice on the rewards for justice piece of this, and I don't think that there's anybody can argue, and I'm sure that you'll hear from witnesses in this short study on this bill that will tell you that the family aspect of it is probably the most horrific part of any of this. When you don't just take a country hostage by policy. You don't just take the hostage. You take the entire circle around that person where they are living and breathing this on a daily basis. And unfortunately, over the last year, I've talked to many families who are in that position and who see their government is acting inadequately on it.
I'm sure at the time where you were trying to introduce to bring this idea forward, you probably have reviewed the current legislation and the tools we have, which is probably that was a trigger for you to introduce this. So what do you believe the most significant tool that this bill will be giving the minister or the system, the existing system, to be more effective?
Well, looking at all of this is one, I believe that there is an inadequacy here. Like it's very clear. It's very clear that it's a missing piece in our legislation. So what I didn't understand is the argument of redundancy. I think there are lots of international treaties that suggest that we should be doing more. There are lots of people in our midst who have been victim of hostage taking, who have after the fact said that we should do more. There are lots of inadequacies in our own dealings with this as a country, and I think that all three of them are important. We've got to figure out how to incentivize people so they would cooperate with us, so we can get our people back as fast as possible. We've got to make sure that we're taking care of families while we do it.
Well, thank you. In how much time? I've got about 30 seconds.
No, you're actually over time.
No, okay, thank you.
So we next go to MP Oliphant, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And
4 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Lantsman, for being here. I have absolutely no doubt that this bill is well-intentioned, that your concerns and consideration for people who are taken hostage is real, and that you have exercised compassion and interest in this bill. However, I'm not going to repeat my speech that I made at second reading in the House, but I would commit it to other members' attention, where I outlined what I believe are my personal concerns about this bill, as well as some of the government's concerns about it. Being well-intentioned is not good enough. You yourself in the House said recently, and I quote, "There is a reason that Canada has a long-standing policy of not negotiating with terrorists. It is that it rewards barbarism, and worse, that it provides an incentive for that barbarism to continue and even escalate." I agree with that. My fear is that this bill at its core is deeply flawed, and it actually encourages and promotes such conversation, and it rewards and incentivizes criminal behavior. It also does not distinguish clearly between hostage taking, where we have a long history of attempting to help families deal with kidnapping, for instance, and our RCMP is quite skilled at this around the world, and state-sponsored terrorism, which is the arbitrary detention of Canadians, and also rewarding of criminal and terrorist organizations. This bill, and we have had much legal analysis, actually enables funding of terrorist organizations. That is illegal in Canada. It needs to remain illegal in Canada. My first concern is, do you understand, or could you explain what you see the difference between arbitrary detention and state-to-state relations is, and hostage taking, and where it is?
So I'll answer your first your first comments because I think I attempted to answer them in the speech. Is it naturally that it ends up funding terrorism? Like, frankly, I'm going to just disagree with you there. And I think there are many people that disagree. And there's 40 years of legislation in the U.S. that disagrees with your assessment. There is a very successful act in the U.S., and it's the Reward for Justice program. It's been around since 1984, and it's helped save lives. And we are behind the ball. And if you think that we're doing everything as a country to incentivize cooperation with getting our people back, I think you are wrong. And I'm going to say that as many times as possible, because I don't think that you have thought this through. I think that you are repeating talking points that were given to you by the ministry. I think
Point of order. I don't take that, and I would ask the chair to please not allow personal attacks on members of this committee.
Thank you. Let's all try our best to make sure that we get to the bottom of
So, Mr. Chair, back to my point, I think there is a great deal of accumulated evidence that has led to the successful negotiation from our ally in the U.S. to get their people back quicker. And part of that has been to enlist the help of those with information. And I think that it sends a vital signal.
For that answer, what I would also like to understand is your understanding of Canada's initiative on arbitrary detention, and how our understanding is that in concert cases, of which I have worked on literally hundreds and dealt with families, how you protect the privacy of an individual who may not be in a family situation that is the best family situation. That our consular officials are brilliant at trying to assess the situation. The number one goal is the safety and security of that individual. There are times when a family can help the situation. There are times when it doesn't. We have families that sometimes think an advocacy program will be helpful because they're absolutely stressed. I get it. I have to deal with them on a daily basis. But it isn't always in best interest depending on the country involved. So we have an initiative on arbitrary detention that we have, and I forget the number now, 70-some signatories plus the EU, where we actually cooperate with countries who have different understandings of the country which may have done an arbitrary detention.
Over time, so very brief response, please.
I'll just say that none of what's in this bill would stop consular officials from doing what they already do, from making those assessments. And again, the minister is given the prerogative whether to use these tools or not. This legislation is an enabling of a toolbox and not an edict.
I'm just kind of curious, you talked about the Reward for Justice program in the U.S. So if you were an American citizen who was detained abroad and a Canadian citizen detained abroad in the same scenario, what would be the difference in their ability to react versus ours?
So I appreciate the question and where I think you're going, but I don't think that there is any case that would be similar, and I don't think that there is any case that has. There's no like silver bullet for this. I think that this piece of legislation gives, again, additional tools in the arsenal to be able to deal with each situation, again, a case-by-case basis, and give the minister more tools to get people back faster, to make sure that their families are taken care of, and if they so choose, to impose sanctions so those people come back faster and we send a signal to other bad actors saying it's not on for you to take Canadians. So in this situation, Americans would have more access to tools that would maybe provide a speedier response. Well, I think over the last 40 years and the success of the program there, I think it's very clear that that they've got more tools, but they've got different rules on how they engage in this in the first place. Fair. That's just difference in countries. I'm just kind of curious. We kind of talked a little bit about motivation and what brought this forward. What was the motivation for you to say that we need to do this? Is there anything in particular that needs to be corrected, or? I think warfare changes. I think if you looked at the last year, I think the 101 hostages that remain in captivity and in the hands of Hamas, despite the fact that this bill was brought before that, I think proves that point in terms of hostage diplomacy being the new global currency on people. And I fear that Like, we should be doing everything. The federal government should be doing everything to protect Canadian citizens wherever and wherever they are. Like, that is the fundamental responsibility. And I think there's a deficiency here to this committee, because I like the chair, and tell you all about it.
Smart answer.
That's right.
I guess I just come back to then. I'm having a hard time examining the parliamentary secretary. He seems to think that this legislation would actually make things worse, not better. Any analysis that would?
I don't. Frankly, I disagree with the assessment. I think that many who you will hear as witnesses will disagree with the assessment. I think 40 years of legislation in the U.S. would disagree with the assessment, and not to take away from anything that the government is doing on this, and particularly our public servants are doing on this. But this is there to not to usurp their role, but to give them additional tools.
It's just hard to explain why they wouldn't accept the new tool.
Sorry?
It's just hard to explain to me or to Canadians why they wouldn't accept a new tool or new option.
Well, hopefully they do. You have a chance to vote for it, colleague.
Fair enough. I'll stop there, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. President. We next go to Dr. Fly. Can she hear me?
She's still on mute.
You're on mute, Dr. Fry.
Yes, I am on mute. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank Ms. Lantsman for bringing forward the bill. I think all legislation can be amended, can be made better, can be broadened, etc. So this is very important that people try to do this. I have a couple of concerns, well, really questions, because I think one of the things about trying to bring a broad extension of legislation is that there can often be unintended consequences. And my question would be about some of those unintended consequences. For instance, you talk about monetizing access to information from people who know what's going on with regard to the hostage taking or the arbitrary seizure of a person. Tell me, do you know any other countries that do this, that pay a person to give information?
Yes, the U.S. I would assume that given Australian Senate's studying it, that they're looking at ways to do this. But again, it's not a must. It's a may, and again, it is a tool that is discretionary to the minister with a whole lot of checks and balances in place already in law.
Do you think that this could create a lot of false information, a lot of people wanting the monetary incentive to come forward and give misleading information that might lead us into another avenue when we should be looking at the way we are looking at it right now in a particular instance? Do you think that that could happen? Because I know that, if you look at all this kidnapping, it's a simple kidnapping in a country, quite often police are loath to have people go ahead and pay the kidnapper or to try and pay other people for information, because it creates a sort of domino effect of all kinds of people coming forward with false information that could create chaos of some kind.
Well, I think that happens in lots of cases, and in fact, we have generations of law enforcement who I assume, like me, you have full confidence in to do their job, gets information on all kinds of things for monetary reward. In fact, we do it domestically in our own system, provincially, municipally, and at the federal level. And I think that we would trust our authorities and trust the professionals who are on this to make sure that they can decipher between good information and bad information, and any new information that would lead to that person coming home quicker, I think, is a good thing.
And that would be so domestically. But what about if it happens internationally? Are you going to be paying people who are bad actors internationally? Is it good optics or even good practice for the Canadian government to pay bad actors to get information internationally from other countries when we don't know much about that person internationally? We don't know if they have other motives. We don't know if they really are terrorists in guise or whatever. I think it's for me, it sounds like a slippery slope. Can you tell me how we can prevent that slippery slope from happening?
Dr. Fry, I think we prevent it every single day, and I think that any information that could help get back a Canadian from being held captive is good information. We should incentivize that information, and again, I trust our authorities to delineate between good information and bad information, the same way that our intelligence agencies do it every single day. This is not different.
Excuse me, sorry, Ms. Lantsman, I don't have a lot of time. I want to get into as many questions as I can. This particular thing is of concern to me because I think you say right now, we do it every day, but you are mandating it. And I think the difference between mandating and allowing decisions to be made by people on the ground who know the issues and who do not agree with a one-size-fits-all solution and can make those decisions, isn't that already happening?
No, I don't think you've read the bill. I'm not mandating anything. We are saying that the minister has the prerogative where she may do that. It's not a mandate. It's not a shall. That's not how the legislation is written. And I'm not sure how to answer your question beyond that.
Well, you have answered it, actually. And I just have to...
Dr. Fry, I'm afraid you're out of time.